The skyline everyone carries in their head when they think of San Francisco, the orange sweep of a bridge, the rattle of a cable car, the gulls circling the cliffs, hides a different postcard from the city's past. A vast glass palace perched on the rocks, pools arranged like blue mirrors, terraces where families strolled above the ocean. Once, where now the concrete ribs of a ruin meet wind and fog, there was a place people called the Sutro Baths, an enormous effort of engineering and imagination that tried, in one ambitious breath, to shape the sea itself for public use. How did something so vast and visible, built to be for everyone, lapse into silence and rubble? What choices, accidents, and stubborn forces of nature turned a people's wonder into a ruin? Before we dive into the history, a quick note. If you love stories about hidden corners of cities, stay with us until the end. And if this kind of excavation into the past feels like your kind of journey, subscribe and like so we can keep bringing them to light. Adolf Sutro arrived in America with a kind of restlessness that later made men build tunnels and gardens where others saw only cliffs. He had begun his career as a miner and engineer. He had seen, at close range, the risks that miners took daily and the ways water and earth conspired against them. The memory of a mine explosion that killed dozens of workers, 35 lives lost in a single disaster, as recorded in accounts of the era, stayed with him. That grief and that knowledge drove him toward projects that mixed technical daring with public purpose. He dug a tunnel to drain and ventilate a treacherous silver district. The tunnel itself became a source of both renown and fortune. With resources and a habit of solving problems that seemed insoluble, Sutro turned his attention to the city he had adopted. He purchased the wind-swept headland where the ocean smashed into the western edge of San Francisco. There, above the surf, he created Sutro Heights, terraces of trees, winding paths, and viewpoints where ordinary citizens could find a kind of cultivated naturalness that had once been reserved for the wealthy. But the heights were not the all of his plan. His imagination reached lower, to the raw edge of the sea. A complex of baths and exhibition space built of iron and glass, where the ocean's water could be tamed into pools for families to enjoy regardless of wealth. It was to be a place of public access, affordable and civic-minded, a counterweight to private clubs. The design teased the impossible. Imagine a hall of glass large enough to take sunlight from morning into evening, with arched ribs holding a roof that caught and refracted the coastal light. Step down a grand staircase and you would find a series of pools, some calmed by breakwaters and sluices that let the tide in and out, others more sheltered, each designed for a different kind of bathing, exercise, play, and spectacle. There were galleries, exhibition rooms, and a museum of curiosities. The whole thing read like an industrial cathedral: iron trusses, plate glass panels, concrete terraces. To pull it off required not only money, but an understanding of water in motion and materials in salt air. Engineering notes, translated for anyone who doesn't speak structure, are simple at heart. The ocean pushes and pulls, concrete resists and erodes, glass gleams but breaks. Sutro and his builders responded with a mix of brute force and clever details. Breakwaters stood offshore to reduce the full impact of surf. Channels and gates allowed managers to fill the pools with seawater on a schedule, using tides rather than endless pumping where possible. Pumps and valves drew and flush water where tides did not reach, and the glass roof let in light while sheltering swimmers from wind and spray. It was an exercise in managing nature without pretending to dominate it, a negotiation, not a conquest. Construction moved like a muscle stretching into the sea. Scaffolding, rail tracks bringing stone and iron, men hauling timber in fog. Workers sang in the morning sometimes. At other hours, their language was the clink of metal and the dull thud of concrete set against the hiss of waves. The project drew all kinds: engineers with pocket notebooks, laborers with hands honed by other coastal jobs, foremen who shadowed the plans and the weather alike. In the quieter moments, Sutro himself would walk the terraces, a small figure amid drafts of salt air, watching the skeleton of his idea become something people could enter. When it opened, the baths did what they were meant to do. They filled. Families came in numbers that turned staircases into moving rivers of color, hats, parasols, children with painted cheeks. It was affordable enough for working people to visit on a weekend, and lavish enough to make tourists gasp. There were exhibitions, naval models, and curiosities that invited a stroll between dips. The pools themselves became stages, competitions and displays beneath the glass roof, afternoon promenades along the tiers, and children who learned to swim in water that had once only the ocean. A small, evocative reconstruction captures one such day. "Look, Mama, the glass makes the water shine like a pond," a child might have said. "We can see the cliff from here." It is a shorthand, an imagined moment meant to conjure the noise and warmth of those afternoons. It is not a recorded line from a primary source, but it helps fill the air with footsteps and laughter for the listener. Sutro's project was, like many grand civic ambitions, both a marvel and something that demanded constant care. Iron and glass do not last indefinitely in salt-saturated air. Concrete crumbles slowly if not tended. The very features that made the bath spectacular, enormous spans of exposed structure, the constant presence of seawater, also made maintenance an unending obligation. After Sutro's death, the complex passed to others, heirs who lacked his singular vision, operators more interested in novelty than stewardship, entrepreneurs who tried to reshape the baths to changing public tastes. One of those entrepreneurs, George Whitney, brought new attractions and a more commercial energy. He added amusements and, famously, an ice rink, a surprising contrast to seawater pools, but well suited to a public craving novelty. For a time, this reinvention kept the place alive in a different register. The baths became a hybrid of civic amenity and entertainment complex. But time, economics, and shifting amusements kept applying pressure. World events tightened municipal and private budgets. The Great Depression narrowed leisure for many. Maintenance bills grew like a discreet tide that rose under the public eye. Pumping systems wore out. The glass roof needed repair. Structural elements required constant attention. Throughout these changes, the baths kept a peculiar public role. For generations, families learned to swim in its waters. Photographers arrived to catch the odd pairing of a glamorous facility thrust against wild surf. Athletes trained in lanes that once seemed endless. For the working-class visitor, it was more than attraction. It was a civic claim, an assertion that beauty and access could belong to all. For some, that democratizing impulse made Sutro a local hero. For others, the place was simply the best way to escape the summer fog with your hair still damp and your pockets light. But the cost of keeping such an enormous, exposed structure functional is relentless. Systems age. Money shifts from leisure to other priorities. Owner after owner tried to patch the gap between wonder and reality. Some experiments worked for a while. Others could not stop the slow slide toward vulnerability. The bath's very openness, the glass that admitted light, and the vast roof that let the ocean sound reach the pools also made it a tinderbox in the right conditions. Reports from the later decades describe deterioration alongside bursts of creative life. Parts of the grand structure were fenced off. Other areas remained open for public use. Photographers documented the place as much for its eccentricities as for its fading splendor. A broken stair leading to nothing. A rusting girder framing an angry sky. The image of a staircase descending into a poolless basin became one of the site's recurring images of loss. Then came the night that would be the pivot of the bath's story. It was a blaze that moved with terrifying speed across the complex, a fire that consumed what maintenance and time had weakened. In the immediate aftermath, authorities declared it arson. Investigations followed, but no arrests were recorded. The language of certainty faded into the language of suspicion. The fire did not write a tidy end to the story. It wrote a rupture. Where crowds once gathered, embers leapt and glass surrendered. The baths ceased to be a living institution and became a ruin, open to elements and to imagination. During the blaze, eyewitness reconstructions speak in clipped phrases: flames licking the ribs of the roof, glass exploding inward, a hiss of steam as seawater met heat. These images are offered as atmosphere and are restrained by the record. This was destruction, and it was swift. People lost a place that had been part of communal life. No detailed graphic depictions of injury or gore are necessary to register the human cost. The loss was cultural and social, a wound to civic memory. Afterward, the site sat where nature could do what it had always done best: reclaim. In the years after the fire, a sequence of decisions transformed the baths from a burned-out palace into a park of ruins. Some artifacts and exhibits were relocated to museums. Some structural elements were stabilized to prevent further collapse. Trails were laid for visitors to walk among the concrete skeleton and read the past in its scars. The National Park Service, recognizing both the site's fragility and its public value, undertook preservation efforts that kept the memory alive while allowing nature to knit itself back onto the site. Visitors today walk the same staircases but with a different posture. They come to imagine as much as to bathe. The ruins themselves are eloquent teachers. The glass that once glittered now lies broken, edges dull like ancient teeth. Stairs descend to pools that are gone, but which, in certain light, seem to hold water in memory. Waves crash at the foot of the cliffs with the same indifferent rhythm they always had. The ocean has resumed a kind of possession. And yet, in the repetition of tide and sunlight, the bath's original purpose flickers, an invitation to the public to stand where sea and city meet. The narrative of the baths is not just about decline. It is also a story of civic imagination, a reminder that a single person's vision, backed by technical skill and resources, can reshape a city's experience of its own edge. Adolf Sutro's life exemplified that combination. An engineer who saw risk and offered a practical remedy. A benefactor who made public pleasures an explicit aim of private wealth. His tunnel saved lives and earned him a public platform. His baths provided a broad public good. But the story also underscores the limits of single-person solutions to ongoing systemic needs. Grand structures require constant communal commitment. They do not survive on one lifetime alone. There are other subtler revelations, the kind the title promises without resorting to scandal. The Sutro baths were, in a sense, a social experiment disguised as architecture. They tested whether beauty could be made affordable and durable. They asked whether the city could maintain an ambitious public amenity in the face of weather, markets, and changing appetites. The answer, complex and partial, shows both glory and fragility. The baths delighted multitudes, but their sustainability depended on steady investment and public will, things that ebbed and flowed with generations. Walking the ruins today, you find small, recurring motifs that stitch the past to the present. The pattern of light on a broken tile, the ocean's smell steeping into concrete, the staircases that lead to nowhere and yet insist on descending. These are symbols more than secrets. Glass for aspiration and fragility, waves for time and reclamation, stairs as invitations that do not resolve into answers. They teach a civic grammar, that public projects are acts of will and imagination, and that their preservation is a continuing conversation between people and place. As the story moves toward its most violent moment, the night the baths burned and the long, complicated aftermath that followed, the pace tightens. The next scenes will bring the urgency of flames, the hush of investigations, and the slow work of stewardship that followed. For now, the cliffs hold the echo of laughter, the glitter of past glass, and the memory of a man who wanted the sea to belong to all who lived by it. The Sutro baths stand in ruins as both warning and wonder, a testament to what imagination can build, and a reminder that memory must be tended if public beauty is to endure. The night the fire began, the ocean sounded the way it always had, patient, enormous, its own metronome against the cliffs. The sky over Land's End was clear, stars pricked tight above the city. A breeze moved along the headlands and through the broken glass of the baths like a soft, accusatory finger. Then, from the ruins, a sudden orange flared, as if the place had remembered how to burn. People on the cliffs later said they saw light through the arches long before the sirens came. A fisherman heading home saw smoke and thought at first of a driftwood blaze on the strand. A couple walking a dog turned and watched the glow deepen, then called the emergency number. By the time engines wheeled up the narrow road and ladders were thrown against concrete balustrades, fire had already eaten several of the great bays. Its tongue raced along timber and tar as if it favored the geometry of the structure, finding the places where the bath's human architecture still held flammable memory. Firefighters fought with the peculiar futility reserved for places once meant to hold water. The pumps, the underground channels, the very idea of containment had long since been returned to earth. Heat blasted out of the mouths of stairways. Glass exploded in slow metallic peals. Within hours, the rooflines sagged and glowed like old bones. The city's emergency radio recorded the names of streets and the cadence of commands. Reporters gathered on the cliffs with blankets, shivering as the spectacle turned from rescue into ritual. There were no dramatic rescues pulled from the pools, no bodies hauled from the deep. This baths had been empty of swimmers for years. Its last attendant left after the doors were bolted against regular commerce. What burned that night was not flesh so much as the capable promise of civic possibility. The weight of a century's worth of hopes, postcards, school trips, the smell of iodine and sea salt on 1,000 afternoons. The public lost a place that had been a container of communal experience. People who had grown up ascending those stairs stood below and watched a soundless grief unspool. In the days that followed, the glow receded, and what remained was a skeleton and a question. Investigators moved through the charred ruins like priests through a changed temple. They took photographs from every conceivable angle, lifted samples of ash, catalogued the collapsed trusses and the warped rails. Wooden arches were measured against blueprints whose ink had been faded by time. In the press, speculation multiplied faster than answers. Some columnists wrote of vandals and squatters. Others pointed to the inevitability of decay, an abandoned building falling prey to night and indifference. A few voices, angrier and more exacting, accused human culpability, negligence, cut funding, the disinterest of a city that had twice failed to make a public dream endure. The official verdict, if verdict is the right word for the half-truths of bureaucratic investigation, was cautious. The cause could not be proven beyond doubt. There were signs of accelerant in some places. There were charred cigarette butts in others. The structure's dereliction complicated any neat conclusion. For many, uncertainty slid into conspiracy and rumor. An insurance scheme, a spiteful act against preservationists, an accident caused by trespassers. In other towns and other times, conspiracy can be the marrow of memory. Here, it became one more layer of narrative to cling to while the city argued with itself. Insurance claims and legal wrangling followed. Ownership was a knot of corporate shells and municipal possibilities. The baths, once the gift of a single ambitious benefactor, had passed through hands that measured value differently. Would it be rebuilt? Should it be demolished and cleared? Some argued that the city could not afford what Sutro had afforded in his time, and that cost and taste had moved on. A steely group of preservationists insisted that loss of the site would be a moral failure, a letting go of a civic ethic that said public pleasure deserved permanence. A more pragmatic faction, mindful of budgets and liability, suggested stabilization and interpretation. Preserve the story, not the functioning baths. The compromise, when it came, had the distinct sensibility of American public life. Partial, reluctant, inescapably political. The site was not reconstructed as a functioning bathhouse. Instead, stewardship fell to those whose vocation was precisely to manage ruin: conservators, archaeologists, park planners.
Mosaics and chiles found new homes under glass in local museums. Sweeping railings and remnants of mosaic panels became catalogued artifacts, catalog numbers written on tags that smelled faintly of smoke. Some movable bits were too fragile or too compromised to save. Others, even chipped and blackened, carried the patina of ordinary use and thus a special kind of value. The National Park Service took on the work of stabilization, an ambiguous phrase that in practice meant shoring up walls, blocking off hazards, and laying trails that could hold the curious without accelerating collapse. Interpretive panels rose among the rubble, their language respectful without sentimentality, pointing visitors to particular details, a surviving tile pattern, the line of a former pool, the route of Sutro's ambitious tunnels. The place became legible as ruin, not anonymous debris, but a curated sequence of reminders. The ocean continued to pound at the base of the cliffs, unconcerned with plaques. Tides covered and uncovered the wreckage in the same rhythm as they had when the baths were whole. Sunlight still made shards of glass glitter like promises. In the years that followed, the ruins took on new lives. Teenagers held illicit parties in the shadowed corridors and left graffiti that was sometimes crude, sometimes oddly beautiful, sprays of color that argued for new claims of ownership. Photographers discovered the site as a genre, concrete rendered poetic by rust, tile spirals gone skeletal, staircases that invited imaginative uses. Artists set up easels on the cliffs and painted the burnt ribs against the sky, not in mourning exactly, but in the complex attention of those who know that ruins are not only endings, but also strange creative prompts. Those who had memories of pre-fire baths came to the ruins like pilgrims, their recollection folded into the place's new identity. An elderly woman who had been a girl once, she said, and had swum in the cold pools with her school, brought a faded photograph and stood for half an hour looking at the pool floor where the photograph had been taken. She would trace the curve of a stair with a finger that trembled less from age than from recognition. Lifeguards who had once whistled across the decks told reporters that what hurt most was not the loss of a building but the rupture of routines. No longer would children learn to dive off the designated boards, no longer would lessons be taught in the space between sea and city. The site also attracted more than nostalgia. Naturalists used the ruins as a classroom. Where concrete had broken away, tide pools formed refuges for creatures that used to live in the shadow of human activity. Intertidal life, anemones, crabs, sea stars, reclaimed niches of stone and sheltered ledge. Scientists and volunteers catalogued species that clustered where the bath's architecture created protected pools.
Você está no meio de uma frase pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental.
Glass, water, and stairs, those recurring motifs, persisted. Shards catching the sun, salty pools housing sea life. Steps that still invited descent even when they no longer resolved. In that invitation there remained an ethical demand, less a command than an appeal, to imagine how public beauty might be constructed anew, collectively, rather than left to the precariousness of singular benefaction. Years after the flames, a small ceremony took place on a windless afternoon. Descendants of people who had attended the baths as children read letters salvaged from the site. A conservator explained in measured terms what would be done to stabilize a dangerous wall. A municipal planner sketched, with a blunt marker, the long-term idea of interpretive trails that would link the ruins to other civic points of memory along the coast. There was grief in the voices, always there, but also a certain steadiness. The crowd dispersed down the paths and along the cliffs. Some stopped at the edge to look out at the surf. Others wandered through the skeleton of the building, touching tile and rust and soot as if to confirm that what had been destroyed was also, in some small defeats and triumphs, still there. The story of the Sutro baths, like all stories of public space, settled into an uncomfortable but honest humility. That grandeur without care dies. That ordinary attention can keep memory alive. That ruin can be teaching as well as tragedy. The ruins, for those who took the time to attend them, became a place where multiple histories overlapped. Visions of the past, arguments about stewardship, experiments in reclamation, and small personal histories of summer afternoons and learned dives. Each visitor carried away a different lesson. Some left mourning what could not be rebuilt. Others left with plans, modest, realistic plans, for the next civic project that might insist on enduring care. Even now, the cliffs remember the loud night of flame in their own way. Shingles of char remain fused to some beams, a blackened curve in the concrete that refuses to fade no matter how many years and tides pass. But even as weather and time corrode those traces, the communal responses they produced, the mobilizations for preservation, the museum exhibits, the interpretive trails, have their own durability. Memory at the baths has become layered. Private recollection, museum archive, public interpretation, and ecological return, all stacked like strata of sedimentary rock. Each layer refracts the same central question, the question Sutro vision posed without meaning to. Who, in a city, will hold responsibility for the spaces that make public life possible? The ruins, then, are less an answer than an argument. They do not claim to tell a single moral. They offer instead a living prompt to consider what public beauty costs and who will pay it.
Then while the ocean keeps its slow accounting, tide by tide, year by year, the human accounting continues to be provisional, fragile, and subject to the next gust of politics, the next shift in resources, the next generation's appetite for maintenance or reinvention. On certain mornings, when the light is thin and the cliffs resound with the call of gulls, a lone jogger will pause at a break in the fence and look down at the ruinous arcades. They will take out a camera or simply stand, and in that brief stillness they will be doing what cities have always asked of their citizens: to hold the past close enough to learn from it, and distant enough to allow for new things to be imagined. The baths, in the end, remain both a caution and an invitation, a ruin that still speaks of communal possibility, if only the living will answer. The jogger lingered until a gull wheeled down and stole the silence with a wet shriek. He had no special claim to the baths beyond the habitual. His route bent there because the fence offered a break from the wind, and the ruin, even in its partial grief, still read as a work of art. But habitual attention is a kind of ownership, too. The repeated small acts of looking, remembering, and telling someone else about what you'd seen were how public places kept themselves relevant. He unfolded his scarf and watched the tide, thinking of the letters he had heard read at the ceremony. Words that turned ordinary afternoons into repositories of feeling each time they were spoken aloud. Elena thought often of those letters. She had been the municipal planner who had drawn the marker lines on the sketch paper at the ceremony, standing with a blunt marker in her hand as if the gesture itself could reliably narrate the future. Her fingers still stained faintly with ink some weeks later, and in the quiet hours she would trace the tentative trail lines with her thumb until the paper's edges softened. She had grown up within listening distance of the baths, and her grandmother's stories had been a small liturgy. The lap of chlorinated waves, the iron scent of the men's locker rooms, the echo of slippered feet on tile. They had become the private text against which she read the public debates of the present. The debates themselves were not heroic. They were municipal in the least romantic sense. Spreadsheets and grant letters, a series of meetings in a community center that smelt faintly of coffee and the cleaning supplies used overnight. A roster of stakes, some sentimental, some fiscal, some rawly practical. A philanthropist's envelope appeared in the mix,
a large check and a long small print addendum that proposed a rebuilt pavilion of glass and polished wood, with retail tucked discreetly beneath and a gated program for historic experiences. It was a reasonable thing to many ears, money to make a shape where only ruin remained. But to others it sounded like a reprivatization of a memory.
Elena arrived early, as she always did, with a stack of annotated plans and a quiet hope that the small, cumulative argument she'd been tending might persuade more than it did that morning. She had organized a proposal that was not dramatic but durable, a phased plan emphasizing stabilization and maintenance, interpretive trails woven into the cliffs so that the baths would be connected to other markers of civic memory, a volunteer stewardship program with stipends, and a modest visitor center sited away from the arcades, built with recycled materials and programmed by local historians and youth groups. Many in the room liked the outline. It appealed to a strain of democracy, that maintenance must be a shared, ongoing act, not simply the fulfillment of a donor's vision. But others feared the plan was naive. You cannot expect volunteers to take responsibility for what the city should provide, said a woman whose bark of impatience announced a lifetime in budget committees. The philanthropist's representative rose and delivered a polished version of the pitch already in circulation. Funding, prestige, economic return. Photos of glowing interiors flicked on the screen behind her. A younger man from a neighborhood group leaned on the podium and spoke with the urgency that comes from seeing public spaces vanish. He described the baths not as nostalgia, but as the memory of a public practice, the way a child could learn to swim in its protectively chlorine-tinted water, the way people from all parts of the city found themselves in the same place at the same time without purchasing a ticket to belonging. If we commercialize this, he said, we compact access into an experience you can buy. That is not what we mean when we ask for memory. The meeting felt like a cathedral of argument. Voices rose and fell, testimony threaded between technical reports and the occasional theatrical flourish. Maya, a local historian who had curated the small museum exhibit about the baths, brought out an envelope of photographs. People in swimsuits that seemed both of their time and mysteriously not. A wedding party draped across the balustrade, their laughter forever in troughs of black and white. These things, tangible and brittle, made a counterclaim to the philanthropist renderings. Elena watched the room in a kind of private surveillance. She could have accepted the donor's money as a planner and used it to secure stabilization while negotiating programmatic constraints that protected access. That was a pragmatic angle. But she also felt the palpable risk of handing a civic commons to private stewardship, however philanthropic the language. The baths, she thought, were less an asset to be optimized than a place to accustom a city to the practice of keeping. She found herself articulating that conviction at the microphone in her soft, steady way. What I am asking, she said, is for us to institutionalize care.
If we accept a single large gift in exchange for a comprehensive building program, we will solve some immediate problems, but create dependencies that will outlast us. Instead, let us ask, how do we design for continuing care? How do we make budgets predictable? How do we teach stewardship as a civic practice? Her words had, to her relief, the modest weight of consequence. A council member listened intently from the front row, tapping a pen against a legal pad. There is a rare kind of politics that is not spectacle, but slow work. The passing of bylaws to fund maintenance.
an annual line in the budget, a small team of paid stewards matched to trained volunteers. The council member spoke later, not with the rhetorical force of the philanthropist's representative, but with the pragmatic tenderness of someone who had learned to move by inches. We cannot afford the luxury of aesthetic triumph if the maintenance is an afterthought, he said. If care is what makes beauty public, we will fund it. The decision that followed was the mixture of compromise and hope that cities often produce. The philanthropist agreed to redirect a portion of the gift into an endowment for maintenance, its money to be distributed through a public commission, but on condition that the city match a modest part of the funds and that the visitor center be permitted within limits as a means of programming. The compromise was not a victory for any single ideal. It was, instead, a scaffold on which other work might be done. Once the city committed to matching funds and to the stewardship model, the plan unfurled at the scale of the small necessary tasks. Jonah and his team cataloged the ruin, mapping the tile, photographing split mortar, measuring the persistence of salt in every inch. Volunteers learned to mix lime and to read the grain of old concrete. Youth groups took shifts clearing invasive plants and rerouting trails so the dunes could breathe. The interpretive trail was not a single grand line, but a set of nodes, a plaque by an old pump house base, a children's program teaching the ecology of tide pools, a listening station where people could hear reconstructed voices, readings of the letters, the ledger notes, the fragments of daily life that had once filled the baths. There were setbacks. Storms laced with unusual ferocity snuck in frighteningly early, pushing brine into seams that had seemed secure. A small section of parapet succumbed despite the best engineers' predictions. Money runs thin. Certain grants required performance metrics that the slow work of civic care did not always satisfy. Arguments reignited about the visitor center's exact footprint. Volunteers, exhausted, questioned whether they could sustain the new expectations. Elena found in those low moments the same steadying conviction she had started with, that the virtue being cultivated was not merely preservation, but attention. Slowly, over seasons, attention produced habit. In a thin, forgiving gold, the jogger returned. He paused again at the same break in the fence, and this time a child in a break raincoat stood nearby, counting crabs in a tide pool, as if the world were a new catechism. The benches hosted a pair of elders sharing a thermos. Their conversation might have been about the baths or their own pasts, but either way, the benches did their job. A school group traced the interpretive trail with a teacher who asked the children to imagine what would happen if no one kept the place, what they might lose, and what they gained by being there. The arcades had not been rebuilt into a singular, tidy object of nostalgia. They remained a ruin. Blackened beams here and there, tile missing like teeth, seaweed gathering in pockets where water collected. Yet the ruin had been given companions, trails, interpretive signs, rules, and a quiet army of people who knew how to read and respond to them. The municipal commitment to maintenance had become, over time, a small federal of habits, a line item in a budget, a set of bylaws, the expectation that storms would be met by more than a single-year grant. What had emerged from the flames and the debate was not a reconciled past, but a new public grammar. Reciprocity had replaced ownership as the guiding word. The philanthropist's donation had become a bridge rather than a cathedral. It funded a center that welcomed the city's voices rather than authoring them.
Jonah's careful interventions had preserved not the baths as they had been, but the baths as teachers, truthful in their ruin and instructive in their fragility. Elena's insistence on maintenance turned an aesthetic project into a civic practice. The city continued to change around the baths. Developers proposed new housing a few blocks inland. Transit lines realigned. Neighborhoods grew denser. Each change brought renewed pressure. Funding diverted, new expectations placed on public amenity. But the stewardship program had become a repository of institutional memory. It could marshal volunteers and budgets, present impact reports to skeptical auditors, and argue in public hearings with a voice that had long since been practiced. On the cliffs, a small shrine of everyday things had taken root. A plaque list of names donated in memory, a mounted display of a few rescued tiles behind tempered glass, a child's chalk drawing that the tide carefully did not reach. The bath story continued to be an argument rather than a solution, a standing case for the idea that beauty lived in maintenance, and that memory required labor as much as sentiment. The ruins had taught the city to learn in public, to arrange their grief into plans, and then to do the slow work of carrying them out. In the decades that would come, the arcades would suffer more storms, and the political winds would shift again. The lessons of one generation could not bind the next completely.
Mas as estruturas de governância e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "A generation could not bind the next completely". Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Fim das instruções. But the modest structures of governance and care that had grown there, the Stewardship Commission, the Maintenance Endowment, the Interpretive Program, made it likelier that future loss would inspire labor instead of resignation. The baths, for a city that often preferred gestures over habits, stood as a continued prompt. That public beauty required more than admiration. It required a communal willingness to pay for, to practice, and to teach the work of keeping. The jogger tightened his scarf and, with the same easy reverence he'd always shown, jogged onward. Behind him, a child shouted at a crab, and the sound sailed over the cliff and into the ocean's patient accounting. The ruin remained an invitation, unmistakable in its incompleteness. Come close enough to learn, distant enough to imagine the next thing you might build together. The city answered in fragments, sometimes well, sometimes poorly. But it answered. And in the answering, there was, at least, a life that refused to be merely consumed. A few weeks after that morning, the Stewardship Commission met in the low-slung room that smelled faintly of coffee and weathered paperbacks. They sat around a scarred table, some of them appointed, some elected, some simply people who had learned to show up. And the agenda was, in its way, the same as it had been for years. Reports from the maintenance crew, a tally of volunteer hours, the balance of the endowment, and an item labeled Resilience Plan, Shoreline Response. A projector hummed. The slides were careful. Maps, dollar amounts, timetables. The language in the room had long ago adapted itself to funding cycles. It was possible now to argue for care without sentimentality, to show how many cubic yards of sand the arcades needed after a northeaster, and how many hours of labor a summer internship could supply. Jonah's handwriting, when it still appeared, sat in the margins of last year's minutes like a fossil, firm, economical, an unwillingness to conflate awe with policy. He attended less often now, preferring to wander the cliffs and listen. Elena, whose insistence on maintenance had once been quarrelsome, had learned the cadence of compromise. She chaired a subcommittee that matches contractors to curriculum, converting civic obligations into paid apprenticeships. They argued, sometimes quietly and sometimes not so quietly, about where to spend scarce resources, on interpretive panels that would educate school children or on storm-proofing the colonnade to keep water from undermining a wall. The debate always circled back to a question no spreadsheet could fully answer. What did it mean to keep something in common?
The answer, as practice had taught them, arrived in small units. A retired carpenter who taught youths to lay tile without sealing the stone from the stone. A teacher who brought her third graders with chalk and careful questions. A city worker who spent his overtime days chasing algae out of the drains because he liked, in private, to stand in a place that was orderly and not ornamental. There were days when the commission met and everything felt plausible. There were days when one storm or one budget cut reminded them how fragile that plausibility was. Between those days was the work itself. Weekly checks, seasonal sweeps, conversations with property owners, a handful of earnest public hearings. Storms came and storms scarred. Once a nor'easter took a stretch of the promenade in a single tide and left the commission scrambling to raise emergency funds. The city's priorities shifted. There were promises of new transit corridors, unexpected demands for housing, competing grants with brighter logos. In the short term, every urgent need could be made more urgent than the quiet labor of maintaining a ruin. Yet the stewardship program, built like a muscle after years of use, flexed. Volunteers were mobilized through messages that read less like pleas and more like obligations. Sign up for Saturday, bring gloves, learn to splice rope. The apprentices arrived in 2-week rotations, then stayed on. One of them became the technician who could read old mortar by touch. The interpretive center, humble, sunlight-struck, warmed by the breath of many hands, became a modest academy. It taught both the history of the baths and the pedagogy of care. How to match a donor to a project without allowing the donor to name the memory. How to write a plaque that acknowledged both glory and neglect. How to make maintenance itself legible as civic virtue. Exhibits rotated, a set of recovered tiles catalogued by hand, photographs of the arcades through decades of weather, a video loop of children counting crabs in a tide pool. The center's director kept the tone steady. "We conserve," she told a crowd once, "not so that the past will be pristine, but so that the future will have work to do." The crowd applauded. The applause was, as ever, an interim currency. People continued to bring their private rituals. Old couples came to sit. A man played the same hymn on a battered harmonica. A woman left a packet of jasmine tea tied with string at the foot of a memorial stone, and no one ever knew whether she came every week or only on the anniversaries that mattered to her. Some tried to monetize the place, small festivals, curated tours, but the community's appetite for commodification was limited. Where the market sought a clean, consumable past, the public around the baths had developed an appetite for an honest discomfort. Ruins that posed questions rather than sold narratives. That discomfort required attendance. It demanded time and weathered hands.